The speaker for the session is Mr. M.J. Akbar. He is currently the editor-in-chief of the Sunday Guardian newspaper. He is also the founder and former editor-in-chief and managing director of the Asian Age, a daily multi-edition Indian newspaper with a global perspective.
I had the privilege of working with Mr. M.J. Akbar at the Asian Age. Just to recall, when the super cyclone struck in 1999, Mr. Akbar was the editor-in-chief of the Asian Age, and I was the resident editor in Bhubaneswar at that time. So we have a long association. Mr. Akbar will speak on the role of ideology and personalities in shaping of Indian politics. Ideologies like socialism, communism, democratic socialism, and capitalism competed with each other to define India's policies in post-independent India. Role of towering personalities like Pandit Nehru and Sardar Patel also played a major role in defining India's progress immediately after 1947. The leaders like Indira Gandhi pursued bank nationalization and abolition of private purses, which was in sync with the avowed socialistic principles pursued by the country. In the 1990s, BJP's Hindutva ideology appeared to be at loggerheads with the professed secularism of Congress party. Hindutva ideology and personalities like A.B. Vajpayee and L.K. Advani dominated Indian politics in the late 1990s and first 5 years of the 21st century. As India is preparing to face the 2014 polls, the contest is being projected as a contest between Mr. Rahul Gandhi and Mr. Narendra Modi. In the current political scenario and in the future, will personalities play a more important role in defining Indian politics than ideologies? Or both personalities and ideologies will remain equally relevant in the current scenario and in future? I now request Mr. Akbar to enlighten us with his views. Mr. Akbar will now speak.
Ideology and personality are not necessarily in conflict with each other. But the subject is made easy by a very simple fact that ideology, and I could almost name the date, collapsed between 1990 and 1991. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and with the immediate collapse of communism as something on which those who had aspirations could depend. Socialism was an ideology. Capitalism is very often seen as the opposite ideology of socialism. But capitalism, in my view, was never an ideology. Capitalism was a pragmatic chameleon. It could adapt itself any which way it wanted. Actually, the nations which call themselves capitalist have more elements of what would be called social empowerment and, in fact, positive economic discrimination than even the failed communist countries. The whole of Europe, for example, the stability of modern Europe is dependent on a welfare system which no communist country has been able to achieve. And that is the virtue of capitalism. But in our country, socialism as a faith actually became a part of our creed with Jawaharlal Nehru and Netaji Subhas Bose, who were the young socialists of that time. And this was about 1927, 1926, 1928. Their first impact was on the Madras Congress of 1928 when Jawaharlal came back from a major European tour. He had also gone to, I think, the Soviet, he had gone to the Soviet Union at that time and came back bristling with ideas. Subhas Bose himself was a more nationalist socialist than Jawaharlal. Jawaharlal was much more internationalist. But the socialism, the left, actually collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chinese pretended to continue or to keep alive communism, but it is not well known what the Chinese did after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead of loosening the party, which they saw as the reason for the collapse of Soviet communism, the Chinese converted the whole of the party's national resources into the owner of the Chinese national resources. That means everything in China, you'll be surprised to learn that the Chinese army actually is not the army of the state, it is the army of the party, the PLA. Every mine in China is owned by the party, not by the nation. The only thing really in common between India and China today is corruption. Because in both countries, corruption has centered around, and this is the unusual aspect of corruption, has centered around the loot and theft of national resources. National resources as defined by spectrum, air, as land, and as the earth, which is mines. In India, by the 90s, communism weakened, but the Communist Party didn't weaken. In my view, the ideology of the Indian left collapsed in 1998 and 1999. Why? When the CPM committed its biggest mistake, which was it denied Jyoti Basu the chance to become Prime Minister of India. Instead of Deve Gowda, Jyoti Basu was actually chosen as Prime Minister, and the CPM the Politburo actually didn't allow him to become. That was the moment when the left could have taken a quantum leap forward. It did not. The left withdrew from space it could have occupied. And today, when the left has perished in Bengal, the chances of it reviving are very bleak. But certainly the chances of the left reviving as a leftist party are impossible. In order to revive, whether in Bengal, really even in Kerala, after the next phase, it will have to reinvent itself into a policy and a program framework which is more acceptable to the aspirations of the young. What happens when ideology collapses? Personalities were once the flag bearers of ideology. That is essentially what Jawaharlal Nehru's role was vis-à-vis the Congress. Today, personalities are now the flag bearers of personalities in the absence of ideology. Ideology has been replaced by pragmatism. And this is actually seen as welcome by most voters, particularly the young. The young have witnessed the failure of all isms. Hindutva no longer. And one of the great changes that we are seeing is the change and the redefinition of the philosophies that guided the non-Congress parties. The non-Congress parties, actually, the BJP was not the strongest non-Congress party when the first non-Congress movement took over in the country. It is forgotten that in 1967, every single government from Amritsar up to Calcutta had a non-Congress government after the assemblies. And you know, after all, you should know more than anyone else who was the Chief Minister of Orissa at that time. It was Naveen's father. So it was the socialist movement and the Congress left which replaced the Congress as the Congress weakened. Mrs. Gandhi revived the Congress by re-invoking the left. But by the 90s, once the Congress had taken up economic reforms, the left was history as far as Congress was concerned. Now we come to what is left after the left has left us. In India, it is not the right. Because the right cannot really exist in a country as impoverished as we are. Instead, we have a kind of total mixed program in which the ideal situation is that the state takes up the surpluses created by the private sector and uses those surpluses, whether in the form of taxation or whether in the form of any other resource mobilization, and uses those resources in order to appease the poor by giving them benefits. Is secularism an ideology? That is the other word which has been. I tell you, in our country, secularism is not an ideology. Secularism is something far more important than ideology. Secularism in India is a philosophy. And it is a philosophy which has a history long before modern politics. Long before modern politics. One of the myths is that India is a secular nation or India has a secular constitution because Mahatma Gandhi was secular. Totally wrong. Mahatma Gandhi was secular because India is secular. And that is what he understood. Indian secularism is not the secularism of Voltaire and Karl Marx. Voltaire and Karl Marx had a secularism, one, which separated the state from religion in the French Revolution terms, and in communist Karl Marxian Leninist terms, it abandoned, it dismissed religion as the opium of the masses. In India, secularism is not neglect or abandoning religion. Secularism is the co-option of religion as equal, irrespective of numbers, irrespective of ideology, irrespective of whether you pray to one God as an Abrahamic faith or whether you pray to many gods in the multifarious philosophy of Hinduism, it doesn't matter. Or indeed, whether you pray to no God at all. One of the great strengths of Hinduism is its ability to include atheism within its spectrum. So secularism in our country is the equality of all faith. Equality of all faith before in society as well as in government. In India, I tell you, it does not matter where you start your journey from, whether you come from the Hindutva right or whether you come from the Naxalite left. It does not matter. Once you reach Delhi, you can only rule from the center. And that is why we are the only nation in the world which calls our capital the center. No one else calls it the center. It doesn't matter. And therefore on 15th August, if Narendra Modi wants to rule India, he has to say that the only religion of an Indian politician is the Constitution of India, which is 100% correct. That is the only faith. The rest of your faith is something between you, your bedroom, your altar, your mosque, or your puja ghar. And therefore, he has to say, even those of us who can't really speak well, or particularly those of us who can't speak well, before we come to an audience as learned and as discriminating as this, we have to prepare. What exactly am I going to say? Half of what we prepare we forget, but that's another story. But if there is a bomb in this room, and that bomb goes off, everything I prepared vanishes. At that moment, what is in my heart will come out. I cannot prepare for a crisis. And therefore, the same Narendra Modi, whatever you've heard of him, whatever you've seen of him, when a bomb goes off in Patna, the instinctive reaction is, Hindu ko तय करना पड़ेगा. At the moment when death is taking place, हिंदू को तय करना पड़ेगा कि उसे मुसलमान से लड़ना है या गरीबी से लड़ना है. और मुसलमान को तय करना पड़ेगा उसको हिंदू से लड़ना है या गरीबी से लड़ना है. That is all we want. We don't want Indian fighting against Indian in the name of faith. We want every Indian fighting against poverty. Because the biggest curse of this country is not religion. In fact, religion is a liberation. It is not a curse. The biggest curse of this country is poverty. All ideology and all personality of our politics finally subsumes into this simple reality. Can you end the curse of poverty or not? The left failed. The left failed to do that. We all begin our lives starting as leftists, at least the intelligent ones do. And we all end our lives by saying it didn't work, at least the intelligent ones do. The left failed. After this, what do we have? We have something which is beyond left and right, which is nationalism. And therefore, the only ideal, the only thing that brings together every ism and every personality in our country is nationalism. Easy to say, use the word, but what is nationalism? Nationalism is bringing every one Indian into the one thing which defines the common vision, into creating India into a modern nation. What is modernity? Modernity, my friends, is not the right to wear a bikini. Modernity has 4 pillars. Number one, democracy. You cannot be a modern nation without democracy. China may be a successful nation, but it is not a modern nation. Number 2, you cannot be a modern nation without the secularism as we define it, not the secularism of the Soviet Union or China, which is the freedom of all faiths. And I'm proud as an Indian that this is the only country in the whole world, repeat, the whole world, where you can get up in the morning and hear the azan, followed by the temple bell, in sequential order, followed by the Sikh Gurdwaras hymns, followed by the bells of the church. There is no other country in the world where you can hear this publicly. This is our secularism, and this is the second pillar of modernity. The third pillar of modernity, as present today, is gender empowerment. You cannot be a modern nation anymore if you treat women as second-class citizens, which has been their fate, I think, since Eve invited the serpent into paradise. You cannot be. It's as simple as that. One of the reasons I think that thank God I'm not an economist, so I can make these claims. One of the reasons why I think common sense tells me why for a long period of time we went into 3% growth and 2% growth, derisively called the Hindu rate of growth, because women were not part of our economy. If you remove 50% of women from your economy, how can you have more than limited growth? Ever since women have entered the workforce, there are other reasons, of course, but this is a contributing factor of at least 1 or 2% growth. You bring in now tribals into it, you bring in the dispossessed, and you will see where India's growth will go. We have kept 40% of our population outside the growth matrix. And this brings me to the fourth pillar of modern idealism, or modern isms, which is equity. There is nothing called equality. It doesn't work. It doesn't exist. Certainly, if Karl Marx and Lenin and Mao could not do it, we are highly unlikely to be able to achieve it. But there is something called equity. There is something called economic equity. What is it? It is, again, not very complicated. The poor must feel that they have a say and participation in the narrative of rising India. The poor are not fools. The poor don't think that if they began their life in a hut or a hovel, they are going to die in a palace. One great middle class, contemptuous, I say that, contemptuous middle class conviction is that because the poor are illiterate, they are also stupid. They are not. They are illiterate not because of their own abilities or disabilities. They are literate because we have never allowed them to be literate. We as a nation do not even remember the tragedy of the poor. India is the only nation which has forgotten the history of famine. The Irish had one potato famine in the 1850s. They still don't allow you to forget it. Millions. Odisha used to be part of Bengal in the first 20 years of British Raj. 1/3 of Bengal died, 1/3, 10 million, a famine. We have no memory. 1942 famine, no memory. Why? Because only the poor die in famine. The babus don't die. But in democracy, if the poor don't have a share of the narrative and of growth, then you are not a modern nation. So, personality as well as ideology today marry very neatly into nationalism. Nationalism is a definition of modernity, and modernity, I believe, are these four pillars. Thank you.
Before I open the House to question Mr. Akbar, I have a question for you. You said the left has to reinvent itself, but with the victory of the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, don't you think left of the center policies are making a comeback?
Well, you know, after having been some sort of a semi-anarchist observer, what else is a journalist except a semi-anarchist? For 4 decades, I never expected the Aam Aadmi Party to survive. Because if there is one thing worse than corruption of money, it is corruption of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is caught out much faster than theft. Because if theft, you're essentially stealing from a rich man. In hypocrisy, you're stealing from the poor. What are you stealing? You're feeding them illusions. I never expected Aam Aadmi to survive for very long. But I never imagined they would implode so quickly. Holier than thou does not work because it mitigates against common sense. It simply doesn't work.
You mentioned that the poor have never given a chance to be literate. So I'm a little concerned about that. I thought that the free and compulsory education followed by Sarva Shiksha and now RTE has brought about a lot of change at grassroots levels, especially primary education. Girl child education enrollment has gone up, school dropouts has fallen, GREs, the gross enrollment ratio has gone up. So why would you really say that?
Because there's still illiteracy. The day it goes, I'll stop saying it.
But numbers do matter. The numbers are dropping and dropping
After
fast.
65 years, I feel embarrassed, ashamed that even a single Indian is illiterate. How long will they have to wait for freedom? Did we get freedom from the British in order to deny freedom to Indians? And if they don't have education, they are enslaved.
Thank you so much for your valuable insights on the topic, sir. Now I would request Mrs. Jaggi Mangat Panda to present the OTV memento.
If Arvind Kejriwal decides 700 liters of water shall be available to a family, or electricity will be available at X price, if he can decide, why can't the government of India decide at what price the 2G spectrum shall be sold? Why should it be the concern of anybody else?